Yo, what is going on, everyone? Today we have another Rick and Morty video. Hope you guys enjoyed this one. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and watch till the end.
Take a slow breath in. Let it out just as slowly. You are here, and wherever here is for you right now, it is exactly the right place to be. Maybe you are lying in bed, the blankets pulled up just a little too high, your phone balanced somewhere soft, the room dim or completely dark around you. Maybe there is a fan running somewhere nearby, or rain against a window, or just the deep and honest silence that comes when the rest of the world finally quiets down for a while. Whatever the texture of your night is right now, this is where we are going to spend some time together. And we are going to spend it on something that has been living quietly inside the minds of millions of people for over a decade now. Rick and Morty. There are things about this show that almost everyone knows. The portal gun, the multiverse, the adventures, the burping, the catchphrases that somehow escaped the television and leaked into everyday language until even people who had never watched a single episode could finish the sentence. Everyone knows the surface. Everyone knows what floats above the waterline. But the surface of Rick and Morty is only the beginning. Beneath it, there are layers. Beneath those layers, there are deeper layers. And beneath those, there are things that even dedicated, obsessive fans sometimes stumble across years after first watching and feel their entire understanding of the show quietly shift and rearrange itself into something they had not expected. That is what an iceberg is, after all. The part you can see floating peacefully above the waterline, catching the light, looking manageable and somewhat charming. A little cold around the edges, but fundamentally legible. And then the massive, silent architecture that exists below, cold and dark and going far deeper than anyone standing on the shore could ever guess just by looking at the visible portion. The part above the water is the invitation. The part below is the actual story. Tonight, we are going to descend that iceberg together. Slowly. There is no rushing here. Each layer will unfold the way a good story unfolds, the way the show itself unfolds, which is to say, gently on the surface, and then with increasing depth and weight the further down you go. Some of what we will find is interesting trivia. Some of it is deeply touching in ways the show itself never announces. Some of it changes how every episode feels once you know it. And some of it, at the very bottom, one is the kind of thing that makes you lie in the dark afterward and feel something you cannot quite name. Something that is part fondness and part melancholy and part wonder at how much care went into something that presents itself as pure absurdist chaos. By the time we reach the bottom, you will know things about this show that feel almost secret, even if they are technically documented somewhere in some corner of the internet. They are the kind of things that change how you watch every single episode afterward. The details that make you feel like you are reading two stories at once. The one on the screen and the quieter one underneath it. The one that the creators left for people patient enough to look for it. But we are not starting at the bottom. We never start at the bottom. We are starting at the top, at the cold, clean air. One at the part of the iceberg that catches the light and seems, from a distance, to be the whole of the thing. So settle in. Get comfortable. Let your body sink into whatever surface you are resting on. Let your shoulders drop. Let your jaw unclench if it has been holding something. Let your breathing slow down just a little more, finding the rhythm that comes naturally when nothing is being asked of you. There is nowhere to be right now. There is nothing to do. There is only this, and the long, soft, winding journey down into the hidden world of one of the strangest and most surprisingly tender shows that animated television has ever produced. Let's go. Section 2. The origin story. Nobody planned on every show has a beginning. Most shows begin with a pitch, a meeting, an executive who said yes. Rick and Morty has one of the stranger origin stories in the history of television because it did not begin as a television show at all. It did not begin with a pitch or a meeting or a strategic creative decision. It began, in the truest sense of the word, as a mistake, or rather, as something even more characteristically human than a mistake. It began as an act of petty, gleeful, slightly anarchic creative revenge against a team of lawyers. The year is 2006. Justin Roiland is a young animator and voice actor in his mid-20s, someone who has been bouncing around the outer edges of the entertainment industry, submitting short films to a small non-profit festival in Los Angeles called Channel 101. Channel 101 was co-founded by a writer named Dan Harmon, who would eventually create the NBC sitcom Community, but at this particular moment was still building toward that. The festival had a beautifully democratic premise. You submitted a short film in the format of a pilot. A live audience watched all the submissions and voted on which ones they wanted to see continue. If yours got enough votes, you made another episode. If it did not, your show was cancelled immediately and you had to start over with something new if you wanted to participate again. It was democracy applied to short-form animation and live-action filmmaking, and it created a culture of wild, experimental, often deliberately transgressive work, because the only way to survive the audience vote was to give people something they had never seen before. Roiland had been submitting things to Channel 101 for about a year. He had a specific talent for shock value, for giving an audience a reaction they did not quite know how to process, for making something that produced not exactly laughter, but the kind of startled, uncomfortable, almost involuntary response that means someone has encountered something genuinely new. He had a show at Channel 101 called House of Cosbys, which was exactly what it sounds like. A cartoon involving multiple clones of the comedian Bill Cosby engaging in various escalating situations. It found an audience within the festival community, gaining a following among people who appreciated its specific brand of absurdist audacity. And then it ended very abruptly, in the way many ambitious creative projects end, with a lawyer's letter. Bill Cosby's legal team sent Roiland a cease and desist. House of Cosbys was over. Now, a reasonable person at this point might have taken the letter as a sign to move on, to pivot towards something original, to put some creative distance between themselves and the dangerous territory of celebrity parody. Justin Roiland was not entirely a reasonable person in this particular context. He was frustrated, he was creatively fired up, and he had developed the specific kind of energy that comes from being told you cannot do something by someone who has the institutional power to enforce that prohibition. The most appropriate response to a cease and desist from one set of lawyers, he apparently decided, was to immediately create something that would provoke a different set of lawyers. What he created was a short animated film with a title that announced its intentions clearly while technically maintaining plausible deniability. The Real Animated Adventures of Doc and Marty. Doc and Marty. Not Doc Brown and Marty McFly from the Back to the Future film franchise, created by Robert Zemeckis and Bob Gale, and owned by Universal Pictures, obviously. Definitely not. The character who wore a long white lab coat, had wild white hair, spoke in a halting, burping, improvised manner, and spent his time convincing his young companion to do increasingly absurd things for dubious reasons was absolutely not based on Dr. Emmett Brown. And the nervous, stammering teenager who kept saying, "Oh man," was in no way Marty McFly. The names were different. Doc Smith and Maharty McDonald's. Completely original characters who bore no resemblance whatsoever to any intellectual property owned by any major film studio. Obviously, the content of the short was spectacularly or deliberately inappropriate. Dan Harmon, who saw it at the festival and later became Roiland's co-creator, described it to journalists as a bastardization, a pornographic vandalization. The short was crude in the way that only something made specifically to be crude can be, the way that something wearing its offensiveness like armor wears it, loudly and without apology, as a declaration of intent rather than as an accidental quality. The audience at Channel 101 reacted to it loudly, not entirely with approval, but with the specific kind of energy that belongs to a room encountering something that has so clearly abandoned any intention of being respectable. There was laughter. There was discomfort. But there was a kind of gleeful recognition that someone had walked into the room and done the exact thing that a room full of people in that specific creative context would appreciate on some level, even if they felt slightly conflicted about appreciating it. And then something happened that Roiland had not planned on. He fell in love with the voices. As he was editing the audio of this deliberately offensive, legally precarious short film, something clicked. The halting, burping, hesitant voice he had given to Doc Smith had a quality to it that felt genuinely alive. There was something in the performance, in the way the character's speech kept interrupting itself, kept taking unexpected turns, kept veering between confident declaration and uncertain mumble, that felt specific and real in a way that surprised him. And the nervousness of Marty, the way the younger character's voice cracked and deflated at every turn, stammering through situations he did not understand and had not consented to, was also somehow tender underneath the intentional absurdity. Roiland had sat down intending to annoy Universal Pictures lawyers. He had accidentally discovered 2 characters he genuinely cared about. He made more shorts. 3 additional shorts were eventually completed, including one promoting the comic book Scud, the Disposable Assassin, and one functioning as a Gatorade commercial, each one further refining the dynamic between the 2 characters while moving them further from their obvious source material. The characters began to evolve, shedding the Back to the Future clothing they had started in and becoming something more distinctly themselves. While they were still a scientist and his younger companion, they were still an odd couple, one reckless and one cautious, one dismissive and one emotionally reactive, one who charged into situations without looking and one who looked at situations and wished someone had asked him first. But they were no longer parody. Something had shifted in the process. Meanwhile, Dan Harmon had created Community and was riding the chaotic, often contentious experience of running a television show on NBC. He was also, at one point in 2012, briefly fired from the show by the studio, a decision that was later reversed but that opened a window of creative restlessness. Adult Swim, the late-night programming block on Cartoon Network that had built its reputation on experimental animated content, approached Harmon during this period. He hesitated, or he knew he would need a collaborator, someone who understood animation and had the raw material of the show already in some form. He phoned Roiland. Roiland said yes before Harmon had finished asking. He had his characters, he had the voices, he had years of accumulated short films that had refined the dynamic between a reckless genius and his anxious companion, had built up the specific grammar of how they talked to each other and moved through space together. What he needed was someone who could build a world around them. The first draft of the pilot was written in 6 hours. Not 6 days. 6 hours. Sitting in Dan Harmon's unfurnished office on the Paramount Pictures lot, the 2 of them built the skeleton of what would eventually become one of the most watched animated series in the history of American television. Harmon had the instinct that the characters needed context, that a scientist and his companion could not simply exist in a vacuum, but needed to be embedded in something recognizable, something domestic that would create tension between the extraordinary and the ordinary. He wanted to build a family around them. An Adult Swim development executive named Nick Weidenfeld made the specific suggestion that the scientist should be the boy's grandfather, which changed the relational dynamic entirely, from something vaguely peer-like into something generational, something weighted with the accumulated history of time and absence and reunion. Having the scientist be a grandfather gave Rick Sanchez dimensions that Doc Brown never had. A grandfather has history. A grandfather has failures and regrets and things he did not do when he was younger. Jitsu, a grandfather living in his daughter's house after years of absence, is not in a position of uncomplicated triumph. There is something already broken in that setup, something unresolved, and the show recognized that brokenness as the most interesting thing about him. The show that debuted on December 2nd, 2013 was Rick and Morty, and its pilot was as confident a debut as animated comedy had seen in years. But what lay underneath everything was still those two voices that Roiland had discovered while trying to anger a legal department. Doc and Marty had become Rick and Morty, but the process had left its fingerprints everywhere. The burp that became a character signature, the stammering that defined Morty's voice, the quality of two characters in constant unequal negotiation. These things came from that original short film. The burp itself deserves a specific note because its origin is one of those happy accidents that defines the show's entire aesthetic. Roiland has said in interviews that the burp happened for the first time during one of his early recordings as Doc Smith, somewhere in the middle of a line of dialogue. It interrupted the sentence. He had the choice of doing another take. He listened back and felt that the burp somehow was right. It fit a character who did not observe social niceties because he did not care enough about social niceties to observe them, who was too preoccupied with larger and more interesting things than whether his own body was behaving politely in conversation. The accidental burp became an intentional signature, and the signature became one of the most recognizable stylistic elements in contemporary animation. An accident became a decision. A crude parody became a mythology. A cease and desist letter became a show. There is a certain comfort in that, lying in the dark thinking about it. The things that were never supposed to happen, the things made from frustration and spite and a specific quality of creative energy that has nowhere better to go, sometimes become the things that last. Rick and Morty was not supposed to exist. And here it is, a decade later, still going, still adding layers, still hiding things in the background for someone patient enough to find them. And then there is the theme music. Ryan Elder composed the opening theme for Rick and Morty, and the theme has an immediate and undeniable quality of being in conversation with the Doctor Who theme. It's the classic synthesizer melody that has been part of British science fiction since 1963. Elder's theme does not sample it or copy it, but the stylistic DNA is present. The particular quality of the synth texture, the way the melody moves through its arc, the combination of adventure and slight menace. The less-known part of the theme's history is that Elder originally composed it for a completely different project, a rejected Cartoon Network pilot called Dogworld that Roiland had been developing before Rick and Morty came together. Dogworld was set in a reality where dogs had evolved into the dominant species, with humans in a subordinate role. The concept stalled, the pilot was not picked up, the project was set aside. But the theme music traveled with Roiland into Rick and Morty, where it has opened every episode since 2013. And Dogworld's specific ideas about intelligent animals were repurposed into the Season 1 episode Lawnmower Dog, where Rick gives Morty's pet dog Snuffles a neural enhancement device that results in Snuffles organizing an army of enhanced dogs to challenge human authority. Dogworld, the cancelled pilot, got to exist as a single episode inside the show that replaced it. Section 3. The Shallow Water, What Most Fans Know. There is a tier of knowledge about Rick and Morty that most dedicated fans reach fairly quickly. The kind of information that circulates freely, that gets passed around in comment sections and fan discussions, that feels like common knowledge within the community, even if someone watching more casually might not know it. This is the shallow water of our iceberg. And even here, if you slow down and look carefully, there are things worth noticing that are easy to brush past. Most people know that Rick and Morty was inspired by Back to the Future. The show itself never hides this connection. Rick looks like Doc Brown, complete with the wild white hair, and the long white lab coat and the specific quality of barely contained physical energy that suggests someone who exists primarily in the world of thought and finds the physical dimension slightly inconvenient. Morty shares not only a name that is functionally Marty spelled sideways, but also that same quality of being pulled into situations he did not ask for by someone who cares about him more than they are willing to admit or demonstrate cleanly. In one of Rick and Morty's more quietly self-aware moments, Rick's garage contains a box labeled simply time travel stuff. It sits on a shelf. Or it is there across multiple episodes. It is never opened, never used, never referenced beyond its existence. The creators have spoken publicly about considering time travel a lazy storytelling device, a way of undoing consequences that should not be undone, a tool that drains narrative tension because it implicitly promises that any mistake can be corrected if you just go back far enough. So there, the time travel box sits, in plain sight, shelved. It is a visual joke about the show's relationship to its own genre heritage. The show was born from a Back to the Future parody and then locked the defining mechanism of that franchise in a box. This does not mean Rick cannot manipulate time. It means the show is careful about how and when it allows that to happen, and always with consequences. The Season 1 finale involves time crystals, called crystallized xanthanite, which fragment time into overlapping versions rather than allowing clean travel. The multiverse allows Rick to visit dimensions where different choices were made, which accomplishes some of what time travel might accomplish without the narrative tidiness that makes it feel like cheating. Rick has access to time's complexity. He refuses to use it as an escape hatch. The connection to Gravity Falls is something most engaged fans know about, but the depth of that connection and the specific mechanics of how it was executed reward careful attention. Gravity Falls was a Disney XD animated series created by Alex Hirsch, who was a close friend of Justin Roiland. The two had shared an office at Disney's animation division for a period, and had conversations about the shows they were making and what it would mean to have those shows exist in the same universe. They discussed planting Easter eggs that would connect the two realities. The most famous and carefully constructed example requires understanding television production timelines. In a Gravity Falls episode called Society of the Blind Eye, which aired in October of 2014, the character Grunkle Stan loses 3 very specific objects through a portal: a leather journal, a pen, and a yellow coffee mug with a question mark. These objects vanish and never come back in Gravity Falls. They appeared in Rick and Morty. Grunkle Stan's possessions tumble out of one of the portals Rick opens while being chased across dimensions, visible on screen for perhaps 3 seconds. Just the Rick and Morty episode was produced before the Gravity Falls episode aired. This means that Roiland and Hirsch had to plan this specific detail months in advance, coordinate across separate studios, working for separate networks, targeting entirely different age demographics, and trust that both productions would execute the specific detail without corporate interference. It is one of the most quietly ambitious Easter eggs in animation history, executed with the confidence of 2 friends who trusted each other completely. The Gravity Falls connection runs deeper. If you look during crowd scenes at the Citadel of Ricks in close Rick counters of the Rick kind, you can find among the background Mortys a pair wearing rainbow-patterned clothing strongly reminiscent of Mabel Pines from Gravity Falls standing with their Rick. It is visible for perhaps 2 seconds. It was placed there deliberately. And in the Gravity Falls Journal 3, the prop book released as an in-universe artifact for fans, there is graffiti that appears to have been written by Rick Sanchez. The 2 universes were designed by the people who made them to be the same universe. The harmonious claptrap card deserves a slow moment here because it is one of the most quietly personal things ever hidden in plain sight in a television production. Every episode of Rick and Morty ends with a brief vanity card from Dan Harmon's production company. Most viewers register it the way you register any production logo, as a thing that is there and then gone. But the content of the card has not been static. It has changed over time in direct response to events in Dan Harmon's personal life. Well, during the early seasons, the card showed a warm and somewhat cozy image. After Harmon's divorce from comedian Erin McGathy in 2015, the card changed. The warm image was replaced by a figure sitting alone on a couch surrounded by bottles, the specific posture of someone who is not doing well and has ceased pretending otherwise. Dan Harmon processed his divorce not by making a public statement, but by changing 8 frames at the end of a television episode. Then, following the beginning of his relationship with writer Cody Heller, the card changed again, becoming warmer. The entire emotional arc of one of the show's creators has been playing out in silent, brief animation at the end of every episode for over a decade, visible to anyone who looks and understands the context. The story circle. This is something that analytically inclined fans encounter relatively early in deeper engagement with the show. And it deserves real attention because it explains something fundamental about why Rick and Morty feels the way it does even at its most apparently chaotic. Dan Harmon developed what he calls the story circle as a writing tool, adapting Joseph Campbell's concept of the monomyth from The Hero with 1,000 Faces, which Campbell published in 1949 after identifying a recurring pattern across world mythology and folklore. Campbell had 12 stages in his original formulation. Harmon stripped it down to 8 and made them workable within a half-hour comedy episode. A character is in their zone of comfort. They want something. They enter an unfamiliar situation. They adapt to it. They find what they were looking for. They pay a price for finding it. They return to where they started. They have changed. Harmon has spoken publicly about requiring all the writers on Rick and Morty to use this structure as a foundation. Every episode, even the most chaotic and seemingly random ones, is built on the story circle, often with 2 circles running simultaneously, one for the A plot and one for the B plot. It is the reason that Rick and Morty episodes feel, even at their most destructive, structurally satisfying. Even when the resolution is terrible, when everyone ends up worse off than they started, the emotional arc has completed. Someone has changed. The circle has closed. This structural discipline is what keeps the chaos from becoming noise, or what distinguishes episodes that feel like they are about something from episodes that merely feel like a lot of things happening. In Never Ricking Morty, in Season 4, the show made its own story circle the explicit subject of an episode, placing Rick and Morty on a train that is shaped, viewed from above, exactly like Harmon's 8-stage diagram. When Rick unfolds a schematic of the train to explain his plan, he is walking Morty through the story structure of the episode they are currently inside. The show explained its own architecture to its audience using the architecture itself. That kind of self-aware confidence is either insufferable or charming, depending on your tolerance for it, and the episode seems aware of both possibilities. But there is also the matter of how the show handles references to scientific concepts in the background of Rick's lab. Fans who have studied physics have noticed something interesting about how time appears in Rick's equations, the ones visible on whiteboards and screens in background shots. The notation used for time in these equations is vector notation, which would suggest not simply that Rick understands time travel, but that he has conceptualized time itself as a multi-directional quantity, something that can be moved through in more than one direction simultaneously rather than simply forward. This is not random scribbling meant to look scientific. Someone on the production team either had sufficient physics background to make this choice deliberately or consulted with someone who did. The equations in Rick's lab are, at least in some cases, a form of visual world building rendered in a language that most viewers will never read and that rewards the few who can. Section 4. Hidden Details and the Art of Looking Carefully. This is where the iceberg begins to feel like what it is. The surface has been pleasant. The shallow water has been interesting, familiar in a comfortable way. And now the temperature changes slightly as we move into the territory of details that require genuine attention to find, things that reward the specific kind of watching that most television does not ask for because most television does not deserve it. Rick's bedroom appears in a post-credits scene of Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind, the episode in which Rick is falsely accused by the Citadel of murdering other Ricks and takes Morty on a cross-dimensional run while the Citadel's investigators pursue them. The post-credits scene shows Jerry sitting on a cot in Rick's room, lamenting the departure of Doofus Rick, who had been his unlikely friend during the episode. The scene is framed so that Jerry's emotional state is the subject, but what is more interesting than Jerry is everything behind him. Rick's walls are covered with photographs connected by string in the configuration of someone running a private investigation. The photos include a Cronenberg monster from Rick Potion No. 9, Mr. Meeseeks, Prince Nebulon, Dr. Mazenon Bloom from Anatomy Park. These are all entities from the show's first season, beings Rick has encountered and evidently found significant enough to document and track. He is keeping records of his adventures on his wall, something between a trophy room and a caseboard. And then, mixed in among the events that have already occurred, there is an image of a character who at this moment in the episode's broadcast order has not yet appeared in the show. Aberdolf Linkler, who appears in the very next episode, Rixie Business, is already on Rick's wall. Rick either has met him in some adventure we never see or has been tracking him as someone who will become significant, or the wall is not organized by past events alone. The wall contains a spoiler. So the parasite foreshadowing across Morty Night Run and Total Recall is one of the show's most celebrated examples of internal continuity. In Morty Night Run, Rick collects some green rocks from an alien environment, shoveling them into the spaceship. The rocks are background set dressing, essentially. But if you look carefully at those rocks, as some extremely attentive fans did when they paused and examined the scene frame by frame, you can see small pink shapes clinging to their surfaces. They are tiny and easy to dismiss as texture or lighting artifacts. They are not. They are the same distinctive pink color as the memory-implanting alien parasites that appear in Total Recall, the very next episode. The infestation of the Smith house in Total Recall is not random or unexplained. Yes, the parasites arrived in Morty Night Run. Rick carried them home himself, unknowingly, attached to rocks he collected from an alien environment. The continuity is explicit, drawn into the episode in miniature by someone who needed to know it was there, even if almost nobody would ever find it. There is also the matter of the dead flies in The Rickshank Rickdemption. Summer wanders through Rick's garage looking for any clue about his whereabouts. She rearranges objects. At one point, she disturbs a pattern of dead flies on the garage floor, treating them as the kind of incidental accumulation that happens in old garages. Later in the same episode, in a moment that happens in the corner of the screen while something else occupies the foreground, Rick reaches down and rearranges those dead flies back into their original configuration. And then the garage floor opens along a seam, revealing the hidden laboratory underneath. The dead flies were a key, a combination lock made of insects, placed in a location nobody would look and arranged in a pattern nobody would disturb deliberately. The show does not explain this. No character acknowledges it. It simply happens, visible to anyone watching carefully, invisible to anyone watching at normal speed with their attention elsewhere. In Autoerotic Assimilation, Rick asks the hive mind Unity to create a television show for him to watch. Unity creates the show. The show features a group of alien characters sitting around a table in a specific configuration that is immediately recognizable to anyone who has watched Dan Harmon's NBC sitcom Community. The alien characters have the body language, the relative positions, and the social dynamics of the Community study group. Jeff Winger's authority-adjacent posture, Annie's eager forward lean, Abed's stillness, Troy's warmth, Britta's contrariness, Pierce's peripheral position, Shirley's composure. Dan Harmon put his previous show inside his current show, hidden in a scene that most viewers process as background texture. The Doofus Rick photograph. Doofus Rick is a variant of Rick Sanchez from a different dimension, notable for being genuinely kind and for forming a sincere friendship with Jerry in the episode where he appears. For one episode, Jerry has a friend who actually seems to like him. And then the episode ends, Doofus Rick returns to his dimension, and Jerry is back to being the person everyone tolerates. In the background of Rick's garage in the Season 3 premiere, was visible for the time it takes to notice it, and then gone as the scene moves, there is a framed photograph of Doofus Rick mounted on the wall. Jerry kept a picture of the only Rick who ever treated him with warmth. He framed it. He put it somewhere he would see it. No character mentions it. The show does not draw attention to it. It is simply there, in the background, a small and quiet record of something that mattered to a person who is not often allowed to have things that matter to him. The detail is more affecting once you understand its context than it would be if it were announced or explained. The show respects its audience enough to trust that some of them will find it on their own, and that finding it on your own makes it mean something it would not mean if it were pointed out. Section 5. The Truth. Tortoise, the Mind Blowers, and What Gets Erased. One of the most interesting structural experiments Rick and Morty has ever run is the episode Morty's Mind Blowers, which aired during Season 3 as a deliberate alternative to the show's tradition of interdimensional cable episodes. The interdimensional cable format had been beloved by fans, but was beginning to feel like a crutch, a way of generating comedy without building story. Morty's Mind Blowers replaced it with something darker and more personal. The episode reveals that Rick maintains a collection of erased memories in a hidden room. Specifically, memories that Morty asked to have removed because he found them too traumatic or too disturbing to continue carrying. The room is full of vials of extracted memory, color-coded. Blue vials contain memories that are Rick's fault. Red vials contain memories that are Morty's fault. Purple vials contain memories that are the rest of the family's fault. The collection is vast, filling an entire room, and we see only a fraction of it. What the visible vignettes reveal, individually and together, is a picture of how much Morty has been through that he can no longer access. He has experienced things so catastrophic or morally complicated that his brain could not metabolize them into regular memory. He is walking through his daily life with holes in it, blank spaces where things happened that he cannot remember, could not bear to remember, and will never fully recover access to. The collection of erased memories is both a practical record and an archive of accumulated psychological damage. But the truth. Tortoise sequence is the episode's most elegant use of implication over statement. Rick and Morty are being chased through a dimension by a creature demanding the return of a tortoise they have apparently stolen. Rick specifically warns Morty not to look into the tortoise's eyes. Morty looks into the tortoise's eyes. And then he knows something. The memory is immediately erased afterward, meaning the audience never learns what Morty learned. What knowledge was in the truth tortoise's gaze that was so unbearable it required removal? Whatever Morty saw when he looked into those eyes, it was something that could not be lived with. The specific content of that knowledge is left entirely to the imagination. But here is the additional layer that very few people know. If you reverse the audio of the truth tortoise during the moments Morty is looking into its eyes, you can hear something. The voice, which in forward playback sounds like alien gibberish, says backwards in what sounds like Justin Roiland's voice, "I'm a beetle. Paul is dead." This is a reference to the Paul McCartney death conspiracy theory, which holds that McCartney died in a car accident in 1966 and was replaced by a lookalike, with the surviving Beatles leaving backwards messages in their recordings. Whether this means that what Morty saw in the truth tortoise's eyes was the confirmation of this specific conspiracy or whether it is simply a very specific and very amusing Easter egg buried in reversed audio is open to interpretation. But it is there. Geez. Someone recorded that audio and embedded it in the episode for the person who would eventually reverse it. The anything magnet sequence is notable for what it does not show. Rick has a device that can retrieve any object on command. He uses it to find a zip tie and moves on. He puts the device down without turning it off. Morty picks it up. What Morty types is never shown. But the result is that young women from the surrounding neighborhood suddenly fly through the air and slam into the garage walls and ceiling and basketball hoop. The show does not tell us what Morty typed. The specific word or name is left visible only to Morty in the moment before the memory was erased. The color coding of the memory vials is one of those details the episode mentions and then mostly leaves alone. Blue for Rick's fault. Red for Morty's fault. Purple for the rest of the family's fault. But the collection is vast and we see only a fraction of it. The ratio of blue to red to purple in the unseen portions of the collection is an open question. What it might suggest if the collection were ever fully inventoried about how responsibility is distributed across years of adventures is a calculation the show has left to the viewer. The erased memory of the squirrel conspiracy belongs here, though we will return to the squirrels in more detail later. One of Morty's erased memories involves him overhearing squirrels discussing world politics in a park after Rick had given him a device to communicate with animals. The squirrels are making specific operational plans. They reference staging a coup in Argentina, similar in structure to CIA operations in Guatemala. They discuss selecting a new pope in case an arrangement involving ExxonMobil and Monsanto in Africa falls through. They mention deploying chemtrails to construct a canopy over Uganda. These are not vague gestures toward conspiratorial thinking. They are specific plans with named corporate entities and real political mechanisms referenced with accuracy. Someone sat down and thought carefully about what a squirrel-operated shadow government would actually be doing and made sure those details were correct. When the squirrels discover Morty can hear them, Rick's response is not to fight them or address the situation. He gathers their belongings and moves the family to a new dimension. This is the same Rick who has faced the Galactic Federation, who has fought his way out of maximum security interdimensional prisons, who has restructured the economic system of an entire interplanetary organization in a single episode. That Rick decided the squirrels were not worth engaging and relocated his entire family to a different universe rather than deal with them. The implications of that calculation are left for the viewer. Section 6. The Great Szechuan Sauce Incident. There are moments in the history of a cultural phenomenon where the audience and the thing they love reveal something about each other that neither party is particularly comfortable examining. The Szechuan sauce incident is one of those moments. Go back to April 1st, 2017. Adult Swim, without any advance notice, began airing the premiere of Rick and Morty's third season on a loop for the entire day. But the episode was The Rick Shank Rickdemption, and it resolved a cliffhanger that had kept the fandom in extended frustration for about a year and a half. The episode was good. It resolved the cliffhanger through a layered deception that operated on more levels than most viewers could track in real time, with Rick engineering an escape that simultaneously dismantled the Galactic Federation's economic system and reshaped the power structures of the multiverse. And then came the final minutes. Rick turns to Morty and gives a speech. It starts with the energy of someone about to say something profound, and it ends somewhere nobody expected. He says that everything he did was not about family or freedom or principle. His series arc, his reason for getting up every day, the organizing principle of his continued existence. It is a McDonald's dipping sauce called Szechuan sauce that had been discontinued in 1998 after the promotional period for Disney's animated film Mulan ended. The joke has a very specific texture. It is layered in a way that makes its meaning clear if you are paying attention. The speech is a parody of meaningful motivation. Rick has just done something extraordinary, has moved through the world with genius and ruthlessness and apparent purpose. And the destination the speech arrives at is a fast food condiment from 19 years ago. The joke is that this is pathetic. The joke is that the smartest being in the universe, stripped of all pretense and all rationalization, is just someone chasing something small and sweet and ultimately meaningless. Rick is holding himself up as a cautionary figure. He is saying, essentially, us that beneath the intelligence and the cynicism and the philosophical framework, there is just want, basic and undignified and commercial. The joke is on Rick. It is, more quietly, a joke about how all of us organize desire around things that do not deserve the weight we give them. The Rick and Morty fandom, or a significant portion of it, did not receive this as a joke. Within days, nearly 50,000 people had signed a petition asking McDonald's to bring back the Szechuan sauce. The official Rick and Morty Twitter account sent a direct message to the McDonald's Twitter account. McDonald's responded. Their test kitchen created 4 jugs of the recreated sauce. 3 went to contest-winning fans. 1 went to Justin Roiland. The accompanying letter was written in an in-universe voice, on explaining that the sauce had been obtained from dimension C1998M, a dimension where it's always 1998. It was charming, it was contained, it could have stayed that way. McDonald's decided not to let it stay that way. On October the 7th, 2017, McDonald's officially brought back the Szechuan sauce for a one-day promotional event at a selection of US locations. The timing coincided with New York Comic Con, concentrating a very large number of Rick and Morty fans in proximity to locations that were supposed to have the sauce. The quantities produced for this event were severely limited in a way that, given what was known about the size and intensity of the Rick and Morty fandom at that moment, was essentially guaranteed to produce exactly the outcome that followed. People camped outside McDonald's restaurants the night before. They crossed state lines. A Canadian couple made the international journey specifically for the sauce. Lines formed around blocks before locations opened, and then the sauce ran out, almost immediately, at almost every location. And the people who had organized their day or week around the specific expectation of getting a small plastic cup of teriyaki-style condiment were not met with the thing they had come for. Mike Harach, the McDonald's corporate chef who had been instrumental in coordinating the sauce's return, received thousands of messages within the first 10 minutes of the sauce supply failing to meet demand. He later described these messages on social media with the kind of detailed recall that suggests they were not easy to forget. Among them were death threats. Actual death threats. Is sent to a food scientist by adults who were not getting a fast food dipping sauce. At a separate location, a young man jumped over the counter, shouting a catchphrase. A crowd chanted in the parking lot while police cars lined up outside. National news organizations covered the events as a genuine report about crowd behavior and corporate miscalculation. Dan Harmon said publicly that he and Roiland felt the creators had been robbed by McDonald's, who had used the show's imagery and brand associations to create a promotion without the show's participation or consultation. McDonald's had borrowed the show's cultural capital and had then been unable to fulfill the expectations that cultural capital created. By February 2018, McDonald's had produced 20 million packets of Szechuan sauce available at all US locations. The packets moved. Those people got their sauce. Mike Harach later suggested in public comments that legal action of some kind may have followed between McDonald's and the Rick and Morty production, and that neither party was able to publicly reference the other for a period afterward. The sauce itself, for those curious, tastes something like a moderately sweet teriyaki sauce with notes of soy, ginger, and gentle vinegar. A food critic who specifically reviewed it called it jaw-achingly sweet. A former McDonald's employee who had access to it described it as reminiscent of a retro Chinese-American restaurant condiment, more sugary than spicy. Some sealed packets have sold on eBay for amounts that significantly exceed their intrinsic value as food. The entire incident is worth thinking about in the context of what the show was actually saying. Rick's Szechuan monologue is a joke about organizing desire around objects that do not deserve the weight they are given. About how even the most extraordinary intelligence is not immune to the ordinary human experience of wanting something for no good reason. The show was pointing at something about the gap between aspiration and appetite, between how we imagine our motivations and what our motivations actually are. And a portion of the audience, instead of recognizing themselves in the critique, became the critique. They organized their genuine desire around an object that did not deserve the weight they gave it. They drove hours. They camped overnight. They sent threats to a food scientist. They were Rick. Not in the way they probably imagined themselves to be Rick, but in the exact way the speech was pointing at. The show has never commented on this directly. It probably will not. Section 7. Deep Lore. Rick. C-137 and the Architecture of Grief. We are going deeper now. The water is noticeably colder here, and the surface is a long way above us. This is where the show's architecture reveals itself as something built with far more care and long-term intention than the chaotic, frequently anarchic surface would suggest. Rick Sanchez's full canonical designation is Rick C-137, referring to the specific dimension he originated from. The story of how he became who we meet in the garage, the alcoholic genius with the portal gun and the drinking problem, and the specific quality of a man running from something he will spend years refusing to name directly, is one of the show's most carefully managed long-term narratives. It was teased and misdirected, and finally, in pieces, revealed across multiple seasons in a way that rewarded viewers who had been paying close attention from the beginning. In the Season 3 premiere, The Rick Shank Rickdemption, Rick shows what appears to be his backstory to a Galactic Federation agent who has entered his mind through a brain-link device. What the agent sees is vivid and specific and devastating. A young Rick working in a garage on early teleportation research. Another Rick appearing through a portal, older and colder, with the kind of confident nihilism that seems to have calcified over years. This other Rick offers young Rick something extraordinary. He has discovered interdimensional portal travel and wants young Rick to join him. Young Rick declines. He is happy. He has a wife named Diane. He has a baby daughter named Beth. The life he has is the one he wants. The other Rick leaves. And then a device falls through a portal into the garage, and it explodes, and Diane is gone, and Beth is gone. It is one of the most quietly shattering moments the show has ever produced. It arrives inside an episode that has been primarily comedic. It lasts only minutes. And then Rick, still inside the brain link, breaks the spell of it. He tells the Federation agent he made the whole thing up, fabricated, a lie to protect his real memories. For seasons after this moment, the question of whether any of it was real hung over the show's mythology. The show remained deliberately ambiguous, with Rick actively interrupting a later scene where his canonical backstory was about to be formally established, breaking the moment just before it could commit to anything that could not be walked back. Then the Season 5 finale and the opening episodes of Season 6 began placing the pieces into their confirmed positions. The backstory was true. The other Rick, known as Rick Prime, was real. He had been the first Rick to develop interdimensional portal travel independently, giving him a kind of primacy in the multiverse. He believed that Ricks who had the potential to develop the same technology should do so and join him. When Rick C-137 declined, Rick Prime responded with something called the Omega device. The Omega device does not kill in any ordinary sense. It reaches across the entire multiverse simultaneously and removes its target from every dimension every timeline, every branching possibility of existence. Diane Sanchez was not simply killed. She was erased from everything that was or could have been. Then, as a further act of either philosophy or cruelty, Rick Prime used the same device on every other version of Diane across the entire multiverse. He made her absent everywhere, in every universe, in every possible outcome, leaving no dimension where Rick might theoretically find some version of the person he had lost. The explanation for why there is no surviving version of Diane anywhere in the multiverse is this. She was removed from all of it deliberately by someone who wanted to ensure that her husband could not find comfort in any alternative version of what he had lost. It is, when you think about it, one of the most deliberately cruel things one character in this show has done to another. So more targeted and more personal than any grand villainy. After losing Diane and Beth, Rick C-137 developed his own portal gun. Not because Rick Prime's arguments had become convincing, but because finding Rick Prime required the ability to travel across dimensions. He began a revenge quest that lasted decades. He developed a genetic identification system to distinguish Rick Prime's specific biological signature from other Ricks and began working through lists of candidates, killing Ricks he thought might be responsible, none of them matching the right signature. He grew harder with each dead end. He grew colder. The drinking that appears as a running characteristic in the show's present-day scenes began during this period as a genuine response to grief that had nowhere to go and a rage that could not find its target. During this period, he was also instrumental in creating two of the show's most important institutions. He helped build the Citadel of Ricks, the interdimensional society of Rick variants, and he was central in constructing the central finite curve, the conceptual boundary that divides a subset of the multiverse from the rest. The central finite curve separates every dimension where Rick Sanchez, in some form, is the smartest being in the universe from every dimension where that is not the case. Outside the curve are the infinite other dimensions where intelligence is distributed differently, where Ricks do not necessarily exist or are not dominant figures. The curve ensures that within the portion of the multiverse Rick can most easily navigate, he is always the apex intelligence. There is never anything smarter than him in whatever reality he happens to be standing in. The most elegant theory about why Rick C-137 helped build this structure involves the very specific nature of what the curve excludes. The Ricks who chose family over interdimensional travel, the ones who made the same choice that Rick C-137 had made before Diane died, would likely be Ricks who never developed portal technology. They would exist in dimensions outside the curve, and the versions of Diane who survived would exist in those same dimensions, the ones where her husband had chosen her over the multiverse, the ones where Rick Prime's offer was declined without catastrophic consequence. By constructing the curve to wall off dimensions where Ricks are not the dominant intelligence, where Rick C-137 may have been ensuring that he could never accidentally find a dimension where a version of Diane was still alive. He made her unreachable at the scale of the multiverse itself, because finding her would mean making her death mean less. The voice of Rick's space cruiser is modeled on Diane's voice. He built the voice of his dead wife into the machine he drives across dimensions, so that wherever he goes, she is there in some form. He has been traveling with a ghost for years, choosing to keep that ghost, choosing not to update the voice or change the system, choosing to hear her every time he takes a journey. This detail is never announced or explained within the show. It is confirmed by context and implication and the specific way Rick responds when the ship's voice is referenced in certain scenes. It is among the most quietly devastating details in the entire series. When Rick finally confronted Rick Prime in Unmortrican, he did so in the company of Evil Morty, whose tactical interests happened to briefly align with his own. The fight was genuine and vicious. Rick Prime, being beaten, made a final philosophical argument that he had been building toward through the entire arc, that Rick C-137 in his decades-long revenge quest had become exactly what Rick Prime had always been. He had made himself into someone for whom nothing else mattered. He had made himself into Rick Prime. He said this while losing, which requires a certain quality of commitment to one's own narrative, even in extreme circumstances. After Rick Prime's death, Rick C-137 became depressed in a way the show treated with real seriousness. The purpose that had organized his life for decades was gone. He had achieved the goal. He had killed the man who killed Diane, and Diane was still dead. There was no version of this ending that brought her back. The revenge quest had simply ended, leaving him in possession of all the worst parts of himself that the quest had required him to develop, without the quest to give those qualities direction. It is, for a show that presents itself as an absurdist comedy, an unexpectedly honest and extended portrait of what grief weaponized into a life's purpose can do to a person, and what is left when the weapon is finally put down. Section 8. The theories at the edge of canon. This is the level where the water has a specific quality, cold enough to feel in your chest, dark enough that the edges of things are soft. Fan theories about Rick and Morty occupy a peculiar space because the creators have been simultaneously encouraging of engaged analysis and strategically evasive about confirming or denying specific interpretations. There is a secret that both Roiland and Harmon acknowledged keeping about the show's universe. Early in the production process, the creative team agreed there was a fundamental truth about the world of Rick and Morty that only they would know, that they would never explicitly reveal, but that they would plant clues toward. Roiland has confirmed this secret exists. He has also confirmed that a Rick and Morty fan eventually posted what he believed was the correct answer to Reddit, and that Roiland's reaction to finding the post, though carefully non-committal, suggested the fan had arrived very close to the truth. The two most discussed candidates for this secret are the loop theory, which proposes that Rick is an older version of Morty, that the relationship is not grandfather-grandson across a generational divide, but the same person at 2 points in a loop. And the awareness theory, which proposes that Rick knows he is a fictional character, that his nihilism and fourth wall breaking are not comedic devices but genuine expressions of that knowledge. The loop theory has become harder to sustain as the show's canonical backstory has developed. The awareness theory has certain moments in the series that are difficult to explain away as simply fourth wall breaking comedy. The ticket theory is one of those fan analyses that achieved unusual traction within the serious fan community. In Morty Night Run, Rick drops Jerry off at Jerrybury, and Jerry is given claim ticket number 5126. At the end of the episode, Rick presents ticket 5126 to pick Jerry up. But visible in the background at the moment of pickup is another Rick, also holding a ticket numbered 5126, apparently unable to find his Jerry. Two Ricks had ticket 5126. One Rick picked up a Jerry with it. The other Rick is still looking for his Jerry, meaning the Jerry who went home with our Rick is not the same Jerry who came in. If this swap happened, it explains a detail that had bothered careful viewers since Total Recall aired. Mr. Poopy Butthole appears in that episode as an established long-term member of the Smith family's social circle, despite never having appeared or been mentioned in any previous episode. The parasite logic of the episode suggests he cannot be a parasite because the family has negative memories of him. But if the ticket theory is correct, if the Rick and Morty in Morty Night Run were swapped with a different Rick and Morty during the Jerry pickup, then the family in Total Recall is a different family. Mr. Poopy Butthole is genuinely a long-time friend of this family. He simply was not part of the family we had been watching before. The creators have acknowledged the ticket theory's internal logic without explicitly confirming or denying it, which is its own kind of confirmation that the question is worth asking. The Jerry Damper theory. One fan analysis suggests that Jerry's presence with Beth has a shielding effect on her, similar to Morty's presence with Rick. Is that Jerry's neurological signature dampens whatever quality makes Beth's intelligence detectable or trackable. The evidence: Space Beth. The version of Beth who left the family and went to live in space quickly became notorious and hunted by the Galactic Federation without Jerry around. Beth with Jerry is relatively safe. Beth without Jerry is findable. Whether this is intentional design by Rick or a coincidental benefit is unknown, but the pattern is there if you look for it. Section 9. Background mysteries, opening credits, and what lives in plain sight. The opening credits of Rick and Morty are one of the most sustained and layered ongoing mysteries in animated television. They are not simply a title card. They are a collection of brief moments, some corresponding to actual events in actual episodes, some depicting scenes that never happen and may never happen, and some existing in a strange middle space between those categories. The creators have been explicit that part of the intended pleasure of the credits is the ongoing question of which clips are real, meaning derived from or depicting events in the show's episodes, and which are fabricated specifically for the credit sequence. The credits change between seasons, with new imagery appearing and old imagery cycling out or remaining as permanent fixtures. The Cthulhu monster is the sequence's most enduring mystery and its most familiar image. From the very first episode, the credits have ended with Rick, Morty, and Summer in the space cruiser, fleeing from a massive Lovecraftian creature. Summer is holding what is clearly a baby version of the creature. The adult creature is in enraged pursuit. No episode for years explained how this situation came to be. Justin Roiland confirmed at San Diego Comic-Con in 2019 that the creative team had planned a continuation of the Cthulhu credits scene that might appear as a post-credits moment in a future episode. He appeared to immediately regret having said this. Season 4 came and went without the continuation. Season 6 offered the closest thing to an explanation the television show has provided. In Du Rick Sick Mort, Rick attempts to use the portal gun, and a Cthulhu-type creature briefly phases through the portal before he closes it, remarking flatly that this happens sometimes. The implication is that the credits sequence depicts an adventure into a Lovecraftian dimension from which the family departed hastily and not empty-handed, which explains the creature's persistent anger. The fuller explanation arrived through the comic medium. The Rick and Morty vs. Cthulhu comic series, written by Jim Zub and illustrated by Troy Little, resolved the mystery in its 4th issue by revealing that Morty had, through a series of events depicted in the comic, fathered a child with Cthulhu's daughter. The baby Summer is holding in the credits is Morty's child with the offspring of H.P. Lovecraft's most famous creation. The creature in pursuit is simultaneously a great cosmic horror of the Lovecraft tradition and, technically speaking, the maternal grandfather of Morty's child. The credits sequence is a very unconventional custody dispute. The dimension they live in. The main dimension that Rick and Morty inhabit for most of the show's run. But the one they move to after abandoning their Cronenberged home dimension at the end of Rick Potion number 9 is designated C131. And C131 is, according to the Morty's Mind Blowers sequence, the dimension where the squirrels run the world. The main characters of the show have spent most of their existence in the squirrel-controlled dimension. The squirrels whose plans Morty overheard were the local branch of whatever shadow organization operates in C131. The family eventually fled that dimension, but they spent a long time in it, potentially under the squirrel's observation without knowing it. The recurring background figures. Fans with very careful eyes have noted that several unnamed background characters appear in multiple episodes across multiple seasons in ways that suggest something more than reused character models. One particular figure, visible in crowd scenes in various episodes, in what seems to be impossible geographical and contextual proximity to the main characters, has been documented appearing in somewhere between 15 and 20 separate episodes. Whether this is deliberate planting by the production team or simply the reuse of a background character design is genuinely unclear. Some production team members have suggested in interviews that at least some recurring background figures are intentional rewards for extremely careful viewers. None have confirmed which ones. Section 10. The creative wreckage behind the curtain. The show that exists today went through an institutional rupture that most observers expected would end it, or at minimum produce a severely diminished season that would signal the beginning of a slow decline. What that this did not happen is itself a story worth understanding slowly. In January of 2023, Adult Swim announced that Justin Roiland had been dismissed from Rick and Morty. The announcement followed reporting about charges of domestic violence against Roiland in connection with an incident from 2020. The charges were eventually dropped due to insufficient evidence, and Roiland maintained his innocence throughout. Subsequent reporting in September 2023 brought forward different and more serious allegations of sexual misconduct, adding additional weight and complexity to the situation. Roiland's lawyer disputed the new allegations vigorously. The practical challenge this created was significant in ways that were not immediately obvious from the outside. Roiland had not simply provided 2 voice performances for the show's entire run, but he had been the creative and tonal engine of the show's sound, the person who discovered those characters in a recording booth in 2006 and who had been developing and refining them ever since. The specific quality of Rick and Morty talking to each other came from one person embodying both of them simultaneously. A quality of internal dialogue made external. 2 aspects of the same sensibility in constant conversation. It was not obvious how you replaced that. 2 voice actors were brought in for Season 7. Ian Cardone took the role of Rick. Harry Belden took the role of Morty. Their names were withheld from pre-season publicity. Adult Swim announced only that the voices would be replaced by soundalikes and that audiences would learn who had taken the roles when the season premiered. When Season 7 debuted in October of 2023, the actor names appeared in the opening credits of the first episode. The performances both actors delivered were not strict imitations in the sense of attempting to exactly reproduce what Roiland had created. There is a quality to Cardone's Rick and Belden's Morty that maintains enough of the essential texture of the characters to feel continuous while also carrying something slightly different, a slightly different relationship between certainty and doubt in how the voices express emotion. For some viewers, the change was immediately distracting. For others, the different voices created a small perceptible shift that paradoxically made certain emotional scenes land with more directness, the slight unfamiliarity stripping away some of the accumulated performance associations of the previous decade. So the fan response was remarkably measured, far more so than industry observers had predicted. The show received critical attention comparable to its strongest previous seasons. Dan Harmon continued the long-term narrative threads that had been building across previous seasons. The mythology continued to develop with the same sense of long-range purpose that had distinguished the show's most ambitious storytelling. The show subsequently received renewals for seasons 11 and 12, representing the kind of institutional confidence that networks extend only when the financial data supports it. Dan Harmon's position in this aftermath is interesting to consider. He had always described his contribution to the show in terms that emphasized structure and character and story over performance. The story circle, the character arcs, of the long-term narrative development of Rick's backstory and the mythology of the central finite curve and the Citadel, all of that was built at least partly from Harmon's corner of the collaboration. The show that survived the departure of one of its co-creators retained the things that Harmon had most directly shaped, and the things that Roiland had most directly shaped: the voices, the improvisational texture, the specific rhythms of 2 characters talking to each other, were rebuilt by two new people working from recordings and memories and their own understanding of who these characters are. Whether the show that exists post-season 7 is the same show as the one from seasons 1 through 6 is a question that does not have a clean answer. It is the same characters, it is the same world, it is the same mythology. But the same characters speaking in different voices, shaped by different imaginations, have a different quality that is real even if subtle. The show went through a rupture and kept going. That is, in its own way, very much in the spirit of something called Rick and Morty, a franchise built on the idea that you can jump dimensions, bury your own body in the backyard, and keep living as if nothing fundamental has changed even when everything has. Section 11. The philosophy underneath everything. At some point in almost any serious engagement with Rick and Morty, the conversation arrives at nihilism. Rick's worldview is frequently described in those terms. Nothing matters. The universe is cold and indifferent. Consciousness is a biological accident with no cosmic significance. And investing emotional energy in anything is a form of self-deception that the universe will eventually correct. This reading is easy to arrive at because Rick says these things, often and loudly, and with the specific authority of someone who has more evidence than most. But the show is more careful than this reading suggests, and the difference is worth tracing carefully because it explains what the show actually is rather than what it claims to be. Rick Sanchez holds a nihilist worldview the way someone might hold an addiction. Not because the substance is good for them, not because they have evaluated its effects and found them positive, but because it provides a specific kind of relief from something they cannot otherwise manage. Dr. Wong, so the therapist in the Season 3 episode Pickle Rick, delivers what is probably the show's most direct articulation of this. She tells Rick that his intelligence allows him to avoid doing the simple, difficult, and glamorous work of being a person in genuine relationship with other people. He uses his ability to generate complexity to escape from simplicity. He turns himself into a pickle to avoid going to family therapy. His nihilism is not the conclusion of a rational process, but the conclusion of an emotional one, a philosophy shaped by grief and loss, and the specific way someone brilliant responds to discovering that brilliance does not protect you from the things that hurt. The evidence that the show does not share Rick's nihilism, that it is presenting his worldview as a symptom rather than a truth, thus is woven through almost every episode if you are looking for it. The emotional stakes of the stories are treated as real by the narrative even when Rick dismisses them. When Morty watches the Cronenberg dimension and understands what he and Rick did to it, that weight is real and lasting. When Beth makes choices about her life that are shaped by her relationship with her father, the consequences of those choices are real. The show treats its characters as though what happens to them matters, which is the opposite of nihilism in practice, even when the characters themselves argue otherwise in theory. Dan Harmon has spoken, across many years of interviews, about drawing on his own psychological material when writing Rick. The self-sabotage, the intelligence deployed against vulnerability, the drinking as both running joke and genuine characterization, the way someone extremely smart can generate reasons why any given connection or commitment is ultimately not worth the risk. These are not observations from the outside. Harmon has been public about recognizing these patterns in himself. Rick Sanchez is a self-portrait made safe by exaggeration, by cartoon physics, by the distance of a character who is demonstrably much worse at these patterns than Harmon is while sharing the underlying structure of the problem. This is part of why the show resonates so specifically with certain people at certain points in their lives, particularly people who have organized their sense of self around intelligence as a primary value and who have discovered, at some cost, that intelligence is not the protection they believed it to be. Rick is not aspirational for these viewers. He is recognition. He is the endpoint of a particular coping strategy taken to its logical conclusion, and the show is consistently, patiently clear that the logical conclusion is isolation and grief, and the specific loneliness of a man who has built so many things and used each of them to avoid building the one thing that might actually help. The show's counter-arguments to Rick's nihilism are woven into the fabric of every season. Morty's emotional reactivity, his refusal to stop caring even when caring costs him, is the most consistent one. Bird Person's loyalty, the quality of a person who remained committed to Rick even when Rick gave him very little reason to, is another. And Mr. Poopy Butthole, the small yellow character who talks to the camera directly and warmly in post-credit scenes, is perhaps the most sustained and most undervalued. Mr. Poopy Butthole has had a genuinely difficult time within the show's narrative. He was shot by Beth during Total Recall, an injury that left him with lasting physical consequences shown across multiple post-credit scenes. In physical therapy, learning to walk again, navigating a life significantly changed by an act of violence from someone he trusted. His circumstances got worse before they got better. And through all of it, Mr. Poopy Butthole maintained his warmth. He continued talking to the camera with genuine affection. He continued choosing to be kind even when the universe was providing extensive evidence that kindness does not protect you from being shot in your friend's living room. What in a show that is eloquent and persistent in its argument that the universe is cold and indifferent, Mr. Poopy Butthole is the counter-argument that stays in the room. He does not make speeches. He does not debate Rick. He just continues being warm, and the warmth is its own argument, ongoing and quiet, and more durable than many of the show's louder statements. The squirrels are running the world. The Cthulhu monster is still out there. Rick's space cruiser speaks in the voice of his dead wife. Somewhere in a dimension he does not talk about, another Rick is looking for a Jerry with ticket number 5126 and not finding him. The truth. Tortoise saw something and passed it to Morty, who could not carry it and had it removed, and now nobody knows what it was. The dead flies in the garage floor are arranged in a pattern that means something if you know how to read it. The show is full of things that are true that nobody has confirmed. That is what makes it worth paying attention to. Section 12. The bottom of the iceberg. What everything adds up to you have made it here. The water is very cold, and very quiet at this depth. The light from the surface is just a faint suggestion somewhere far above. The iceberg's full architecture is visible from here, all of it, the simple and charming part that floats in the light and the vast, dark, intricate structure that holds it up. Rick and Morty began as an act of creative revenge, a crudely animated parody made to annoy lawyers. Us voiced by a man who fell in love with the sounds he was making and could not let them go even after the original provocation had faded. It became, over the course of more than a decade of episodes, something that contains multitudes. It contains Easter eggs planted across 2 networks, 2 studios, 2 audiences, coordinated months in advance to pay off for the viewer patient enough to have watched both shows and observant enough to notice a notebook and a pen and a yellow coffee mug falling through a portal at exactly the right moment. It contains a score composed for a dead cartoon about intelligent dogs, repurposed into the opening theme of one of the most successful animated series in American television history. It contains a showrunner's divorce and his subsequent relationship, documented in 8 frames at the end of every episode, visible to anyone who takes the time to look and understands the context that makes the change meaningful. It contains dead flies arranged in patterns that open hidden doors. It contains a photograph of a kind Rick mounted in a frame in a sad man's garage, evidence of a friendship that the show treated as trivial, but the character treated as significant. It contains a truth tortoise whose words, reversed, confirm that Paul McCartney is dead. It contains the voice of a dead woman built into a machine that her husband drives through every dimension she is no longer in. It contains squirrels running a shadow government with more operational sophistication than most human shadow governments in the history of actual geopolitics. And it contains the information that the protagonist family has been living in the squirrel dimension for most of the show's run. It contains a secret that only the people who made it know, an answer to a question that one anonymous person on Reddit may have arrived at and been quietly, ambiguously confirmed. It contains a Cthulhu monster that has been chasing the main characters through the credits of every episode since 2013 and whose origin was not explained within the show itself for nearly a decade. It contains a ticket numbered 5126 that may have resulted in a family swap that altered the entire composition of who we have been watching. And underneath all of that, it contains a scientist who lost the only life he wanted and became the most extraordinary being in the universe while trying to find his way back to it, and who eventually found what he was looking for, and then had to discover that getting the thing and having the thing back are not the same, that the wound you spent decades weaponizing does not close just because you have done what you set out to do. It contains a man who built the voice of his dead wife into his car, who kept her present in the only form still available to him, who traveled across infinite dimensions, choosing to hear her every time he started the engine, because some losses are not things you move on from. They are things you learn to carry, and then carry, and keep carrying, all the way to wherever you are going. The show is about a lot of things. It wears many of them as comedy, as absurdism, as the specific texture of a show that will put an argument about free will inside a McDonald's joke, inside something that will make you feel genuinely sad if you follow it to its conclusion. But underneath all of the layers, at the bottom of the iceberg, it is about what love looks like when it does not know how to express itself cleanly. It is about the gap between how much you feel and how little you show. It is about a man who chose his family over the multiverse and then lost his family to the multiverse and then spent the rest of his long life making a version of a family out of what was available. The daughter of a Rick who abandoned her and her nervous grandson who worries about everything and her sad husband who just wants to be valued. It is about the specific quality of caring for someone badly, which is different from not caring at all, even when from the outside it sometimes looks the same. Rick keeps coming back to the garage. He keeps going on adventures with Morty. He keeps choosing, in his imperfect and often harmful and genuinely loving way, to stay. That might be what the show is ultimately saying. Not that the squirrels are not there, not that the universe is not cold, not that Rick is wrong about any particular fact of cosmic scale, but that the presence of the squirrels is not a sufficient reason to stop being decent to the people who are in the room with you right now, and that staying, which is the most ordinary thing, is also sometimes the most extraordinary choice available. The iceberg goes deeper than we got tonight. It always does. There are things in the show that have not been found yet. It's details planted for the person who will watch the right episode at the right moment and see something nobody has seen before. There are fan theories that are closer to the truth than the people who wrote them know. There is a secret that is probably still safe. But you have been here, in the deep water, and you know more now than you did at the surface. And you are tired, probably, in the good way that comes after spending time with something that was worth the attention. Let it go now. Let the iceberg float back up to where it lives, somewhere between the seen and the unseen. Let your breathing slow all the way down. Let the thoughts about Diane and squirrels and ticket number 5126 and the truth tortoise and all the dead flies arranged just right in the garage floor drift and separate and settle into wherever good things settle when you stop holding them. You were here tonight. The water was good. The things in it were worth finding. If something in here sparked a feeling, left you wanting to pause an episode you have seen 100 times and look at it differently, made you feel that specific quality of affection for a story that is, under everything, genuinely trying to tell the truth, please like this video and subscribe to Q Pickle Rick. New explorations go up regularly, and each one is made with the same care and the same slowness that went into this one. The comment section is a wonderful place to share the details this video missed. The theories you have been sitting on, the moments in the show that you noticed and nobody seemed to talk about. The multiverse is infinite. We have only explored one small corner of it tonight. The squirrels will be here when you wake up. They always are. And if Rick taught us anything, it is that even knowing the squirrels are there, even knowing the universe is vast and indifferent and running on mechanisms too large and too strange to fully understand, you can still choose to go on one more adventure. You can still choose to care about the person in the passenger seat. You can still choose to stay. Sweet dreams. Script by Q Pickle. Rick fall asleep to the Rick and Morty. Iceberg R. https://www.youtube.com/@QPickleRick. Supplemental section. OI, the interdimensional cable episodes and what they reveal about how the show was made. If you want to understand the texture of how Rick and Morty was actually produced, the creative environment inside the writer's room, the specific culture of collaboration and improvisation and managed chaos that generated the show episode by episode, the interdimensional cable episodes are probably the most transparent window into it. The premise of the interdimensional cable episodes is elegant in its simplicity. Rick installs a cable box in the television that receives signals from across the multiverse, allowing the family to watch television programming from infinite alternate dimensions. This premise is, functionally, sort of frame for the writers to pitch ideas as brief, self-contained comedy vignettes that would never sustain a full episode but that are funny or strange or specific enough to exist for 30 seconds. It is structured improvisation, a format that allows for maximum creative range while maintaining the thin connective tissue of a shared framing device. The episodes that use this format, most directly Ricksty Minutes in Season 1 and Interdimensional Cable 2, Tempting Fate in Season 2, were partly scripted and partly improvised. Justin Roiland in particular was given significant latitude to improvise within the format, to voice characters and situations on the spot, and find where the comedy lived through performance rather than through prior construction. The results have a specific quality that distinguishes them from the show's more plotted episodes. A rougher edge, a wilder unpredictability, a sense that something could go anywhere because nobody knows yet where it is going. This improvisational quality was built into the show's production process from its earliest stages. After writing sessions produced a script, Roland would record his lines multiple times with deliberate room for variation. He would do the scripted version, then do a version where he allowed himself to riff around the lines, finding different rhythms and unexpected asides. The scripts were then revised in response to the best of what the recording sessions produced. Lines that landed during improvisation would be incorporated. Moments that emerged spontaneously, including the specific way Rick might interrupt himself mid-sentence or the way Morty's voice would crack at a particular point in a scene, would be written back in. This is how the show has the quality it does of feeling genuinely discovered rather than constructed, of seeming like something happening rather than something being performed. The best moments in Rick and Morty have the specific warmth of a thing that surprised the people making it, and the production process was structured to allow and capture those surprises. The Ricksty Minutes episode is also notable for a subplot that runs alongside the interdimensional cable vignettes, and that is arguably one of the most emotionally effective things the show has ever done. While Rick and Morty watch television from other dimensions, so Beth and Summer have a conversation in the garage that begins as a conflict about Summer's place in the family and evolves into something much larger. They use Rick's device to look at the alternate dimensions where Beth had chosen not to have Summer, where Summer had not been born, and see what Beth's life looks like in those alternatives. The answer, which Beth sees and which the episode presents with deliberate restraint, is complicated in ways that resist easy summary. Beth, in the dimensions where Summer was never born, is not obviously happier or more fulfilled. She is different. She has made different choices, and those choices have led to different places. What it means for Beth to look at her life without Summer and not find a simple confirmation that Summer was the right choice is left for the viewer to work through. The emotional weight of that subplot, sitting alongside the deliberately absurdist comedy of the cable segments, demonstrates something the show does consistently and well. It creates a tonal architecture in which comedy and genuine emotional complexity coexist without either undermining the other. The comedy is not a defense against the emotion. The emotion is not a punishment for the comedy. They are simply both present, the way both are present in actual human experience, sometimes simultaneously, sometimes in rapid succession, sometimes in a way that makes it impossible to say which one you are feeling at a given moment. Summer's discovery, in that episode, of the probability that she was almost not born is handled with a restraint that makes it more affecting rather than less. The scene where she asks Rick about the other Summers, whether they exist somewhere in some dimension, and Rick gives her the specific kind of answer that is technically compassionate and existentially devastating, is a model of how the show balances its genres. It does not let the comedy of the cable format override the seriousness of what Summer is processing. And it does not let the seriousness override the comedy. It simply presents both and trusts the viewer to hold both at once. Supplemental Section B: The Vindicators and what the show does with archetypes. The Vindicators are one of Rick and Morty's most extended engagements with a specific genre tradition, the superhero team, and what the episode Vindicators 3, The Return of World Ender does with that tradition is worth understanding as a piece of what the show is actually trying to say when it points at something familiar. But the Vindicators are a superhero team that exists in the show's universe, a group of extraordinary beings who band together to fight cosmic threats. They have the structure of the genre: the charismatic leader, the physically powerful one, the tech genius, the morally principled one, the funny sidekick. They have an aesthetic built on spectacle and clarity, good and evil legible from a distance, heroism presented as a consistent character trait rather than a situational choice. They are what Rick and Morty would look like if it were a different kind of show. And the episode reveals, through the specific mechanism of Rick having set up an elaborate series of challenges while blackout drunk, that the Vindicators are none of the things they appear to be. They are petty, they are compromised, or they have secrets that directly contradict the values they publicly embody. Their leader has done something that is not forgivable, and the revelation of that something unfolds through challenges that Rick designed without knowing exactly what he was doing because he was not conscious when he designed them. The episode is an argument that archetypes are lies. Not the useful kind of lies, not the kind of simplification that helps communicate something true in a condensed form, but the genuinely deceptive kind. The kind that presents a flattering fiction about human nature and asks you to use that fiction as a template for evaluating real people. The Vindicators look like heroes. The framework of superhero narrative has trained the audience to read their look as an accurate signal. The episode takes that training and shows how badly it fails when applied to actual beings with actual histories and actual compromises. This is not a cynical point. It is not saying that heroism does not exist or that people who try to do good are necessarily frauds. It is saying that the genre conventions that attach heroism to aesthetic presentation, to a costume and a name and a clear narrative role are not reliable guides to the actual ethical content of a person's life. Rick, who wears no costume and claims no heroic identity and actively resists being read as a protagonist, is, in some episodes, more reliably ethical than the beings who have organized their public existence around the performance of heroism. Not always, not consistently, but sometimes. And that sometimes matters in a show that is always asking whether the surface is the same as the depth. Morty's relationship to the Vindicators is also doing something specific. He admires them. He has used their adventures as a psychological refuge from the more complicated and less heroically framed adventures he goes on with Rick, as a template of what adventures are supposed to look like when they go right. The episode takes that refuge and dismantles it, showing Morty that the clean narrative he was using to comfort himself was never accurate. This is painful for him. It is also, from the show's perspective, necessary. Morty's growth as a character requires him to let go of the idea that there is a cleaner version of what he is doing somewhere, some adventure without moral compromise, some relationship without complexity. Rick is what he has, and Rick, for all his flaws, does not lie to Morty about the cost of what they do. Supplemental section. C. The Morty Paradox and what it means to be a sidekick. The Citadel of Ricks, as a narrative location, is one of the show's most sustained and interesting sociological thought experiments. It is a civilization built by geniuses organized around the belief that their genius entitles them to a superior social position. And it is populated not only by Ricks, but by the Mortys who have been assigned to them as companions, signal dampeners, adventure partners, and, in the social hierarchy of the Citadel, a permanent underclass. Though what the Citadel does with its Mortys is revealing about what the show thinks about the relationship between intelligence and power, and the way power structures justify themselves through the language of natural hierarchy. At the Citadel, Mortys attend Morty School, an institution that does not exist to develop Morty's potential but to train them for their assigned function as sidekicks. They learn how to follow. They learn how to react rather than initiate. They learn the specific set of skills useful for being the person who makes the genius work better without being the genius themselves. The education is not neutral. It is ideological. The Ricks at the Citadel believe this arrangement is natural because they believe they are naturally superior. They have organized an entire society around this belief. They created institutions that enforce it, built a mythology that explains why it is just. And the mythology is self-reinforcing in the way that ideologies based on claimed natural hierarchy always are. The Ricks are on top because they are smarter. They are smarter because they developed the technology. They developed the technology because they had the capacity to do so. They had the capacity because they are Ricks. The circle closes. The conclusion is built into the premises. Evil Morty is the most interesting figure to emerge from this environment precisely because he sees the structure clearly and refuses to accept it. He is not simply a villain in the conventional sense. He is someone who has looked at the system in which he exists, understood exactly how it works and why it is designed the way it is, and decided that the appropriate response is not accommodation or even reform, but demolition. He does not want a better Citadel. He wants no Citadel. He does not want to be a Morty at the top of the hierarchy. He wants to leave the hierarchy entirely and exist somewhere the hierarchy has no jurisdiction. This is a much more radical position than it might appear. Most narratives about oppressive systems end with the oppressed gaining power within the system, taking the positions previously held by those who oppressed them. Evil Morty recognizes that taking those positions would make him part of the same system, bound by the same structure, dependent on the same arrangements. His ambition is not for power within the existing framework. It is for freedom from the framework itself. This is why he breaks the central finite curve rather than simply taking control of the Citadel. Taking control of the Citadel would make him the new apex of the same hierarchy. Breaking the curve removes him from the hierarchy's scope entirely. The moment he flies through the gap in the curve, heading into a part of the multiverse where Rick is not the smartest person alive, is the show at its most genuinely radical. It is not a hero's victory. It is not the overthrow of an unjust order followed by the establishment of a just one. It is a single person choosing to stop playing the game entirely and walking away from the table. Whether the territory outside the curve is better or worse, safer or more dangerous, is unknown. What is known is that it is different. The rules that made him a sidekick by definition do not apply there. The question the show leaves open is whether this constitutes freedom or simply a different kind of constraint. Outside the central finite curve, a Morty might have genuine possibilities unavailable within it. Or outside the curve might be even more dangerous, populated by things that make even Rick seem small. Evil Morty does not know what he is flying into. He knows only that he would rather face that uncertainty than continue in a system designed to limit him. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that this radical act of self-liberation, the most genuinely transformative thing any character in the show has done, was accomplished by the character the show's own internal mythology designates as the least powerful type of being in the multiverse. A Morty took down a civilization of Ricks. A Morty broke the wall that defined the universe. A Morty chose freedom while every Rick was still playing the game they designed to ensure they would always win. Supplemental section. D. The grief architecture, how the show handles loss over time. One of the most structurally interesting things about Rick and Morty is the way it handles loss across multiple seasons, the way it accumulates absence and allows that absence to build weight rather than resolving it or pretending it did not happen. Rick has lost things throughout the show, repeatedly, in different registers. He has lost dimensions. He has abandoned families, more than once, more than is ever fully tallied. He has lost friends to violence and to time and to the specific entropy that attaches itself to relationships conducted at the pace of interdimensional adventure. While each loss is handled differently, but they share a quality of being genuinely irreversible. The show does not have a reset button that can reach back far enough to undo meaningful losses. It operates in a universe where the things that happen have happened. The Cronenberg dimension is the clearest early example of this. After the events of Rick Potion number 9, Rick and Morty abandon the dimension they grew up in. They move into a replacement dimension and take the places of the Rick and Morty there who had just died. They bury their own bodies in the backyard and continue living as those bodies' replacements. The original Beth, Summer, and Jerry of Rick and Morty's home dimension are left in a Cronenberged world. The show acknowledges this. Morty is devastated by it in a way that Rick is not. And then the show moves on. But it does not pretend the Cronenberg dimension did not happen. It returns to it in later seasons. It returns to the question of what it means to have abandoned a family, to have replaced a dead version of yourself and just kept going. The abandonment is not resolved. The grief is not completed. It is simply carried differently by different characters across different episodes, surfacing sometimes and submerging again in the natural rhythm of a show that has many stories to tell. Bird Person's fate is handled in a similar register. He is Rick's oldest friend, a veteran of battles they fought together, the person who has known Rick longest and possibly understands him best. He is shot at his own wedding by an agent of the Galactic Federation who had been undercover as his bride. He does not die cleanly. He is transformed. Was his body taken and rebuilt as Phoenix Person, a cyborg weapon of the Galactic Federation who retains Bird Person's face and skills, but none of his loyalty, none of his warmth, none of the specific quality of presence that made him meaningful to Rick. Rick's response to Phoenix Person when they meet in combat is one of the show's most emotionally specific moments. He is fighting something that looks like his friend and moves like his friend and remembers nothing about what their friendship was. He wins the fight, and winning the fight feels like nothing because there was nothing there to defeat, just the body of someone he cared about, repurposed into something that does not know his name. The eventual restoration of Bird Person is handled with restraint. He returns in a later season, some version of himself recovered. Though the show does not spend a long time dwelling on the mechanics of how this happened or what exactly was recovered and what was lost. The reunion is quiet. The things that remain unspoken between Rick and Birdperson, the specific texture of a friendship that survived both Rick's inability to be a good friend and Birdperson's wedding being turned into an ambush, are more present in what is not said than in what is said. This is the show's specific skill with grief and loss and damage to relationships. It does not narrate these things directly. It shows you what is still there, what is absent, what has been replaced by something different, and trusts you to feel the difference between the before and the after without needing it explained. The grief architecture of the show is built not out of scenes of explicit mourning, but out of the specific texture of how people who have lost things move through subsequent scenes in which that loss is not the subject. Rick drinking, Rick deflecting, Rick choosing adventure over conversation, Rick building things instead of saying things. These are all, at some level, the show's way of showing you someone in permanent, unacknowledged mourning. Not for any single thing, though Diane is certainly central, but for the cumulative weight of everything that happens when you live the life Rick has lived at the speed Rick has lived it. The grief is not a plot point. It is the water he swims in. It is the specific gravity of every scene he is in. Supplemental section. The music of the show. What the score reveals about emotional intent. The scoring of Rick and Morty is a layer of the show's construction that receives less attention than the writing or the voice performance or the animation, but that does significant emotional work in every episode. The show uses music in a way that is rarely called attention to because the music is doing exactly what good film and television scoring does, which is to tell you how to feel about something before you have consciously processed what you are seeing. Ryan Elder, who composed the show's main theme, also scored much of the series. His scoring has a specific quality that comes from the show's particular tonal range. It needs to be capable of full absurdist comedy one moment and something approaching genuine emotional devastation the next, often within the same scene. The challenge of scoring something like this is not finding music for each tone in isolation, but finding a musical language that can contain both tones simultaneously, that can hold comedy and sorrow in a single gesture the way the best moments in the show do. The show's use of needle drops, licensed popular music placed at specific moments, has also been particularly considered. The use of Hurt by 9 Inch Nails at the end of Get Swifty comes at a moment of genuine emotional weight and lands with exactly the combination of irony and sincerity that the show's best moments have. The use of For the Damaged Coda by Blonde Redhead during scenes involving Evil Morty became so strongly associated with that character's presence that it functions almost as a character theme for him, a piece of music that the show trained its audience to associate with a specific kind of cold, patient, world-restructuring intelligence. The selection of music for specific moments is not random. There are people on the production team whose job is to think about what is playing when something significant happens, and the care that goes into those choices is audible if you listen for it. The moments in the show that land hardest, the moments that produce the specific feeling of something that was comedy becoming something else, are frequently the moments where the music has quietly shifted to something that the comedy's soundtrack would not use. The theme of Birdperson's wedding episode uses celebratory music with deliberate irony, setting up an expectation of happiness that makes the subsequent violence more violent by contrast. The music tells you one thing, the events tell you another. The gap between them is where the emotional impact lives. This is scoring as storytelling, not scoring as illustration. Supplemental section. What the show has said about its own future. One of the more interesting meta-level conversations that exists around Rick and Morty involves the show's explicit discussion of its own continuation. or its awareness of what it means to be a long-running franchise with contractual obligations and audience expectations, and the specific pressures that come with being extremely successful at a particular thing and then being expected to keep being that thing indefinitely. The deal that Adult Swim signed with Rick and Morty in 2018, ordering 70 new episodes over an unspecified number of seasons, was extraordinary by any measure. 70 episodes is more than most shows ever make. It is an institutional commitment to the show continuing that goes beyond what most networks will offer, and that carries its own specific weight. When you have ordered 70 episodes, you are not just renewing a show season by season. You are building a manufacturing facility for a specific kind of creative product and expecting it to keep producing. Dan Harmon has spoken about this pressure with his characteristic combination of honesty and dark humor. The show Never Rick and Morty in Season 4's, among other things, a meditation on what it feels like to have committed to producing a large number of things and to be working through the anxiety of whether you can fill that quantity with actual quality. The story train, which is the literal mechanism of the episode, is a train shaped like a story circle that traps Rick and Morty in narrative loops they cannot easily escape. It is also, transparently, a metaphor for a show that has committed to running for a very long time and is working through what that commitment means for the creative decisions it makes. Rick's line in that episode, when he sees the schematic of the train and recognizes that, of course this thing is just a circle, you'd think it was so goddamn complicated, is at once a joke about the story circle, an acknowledgement of the show's own structural conventions, and a comment on how complicated the simple obligation to keep telling the same story can feel when you are the person responsible for telling it. The show has consistently managed the tension between fulfilling audience expectations, which are now very specific and detailed after many seasons, and maintaining the creative restlessness that made the early seasons interesting. Some episodes lean into expectations. Some episodes actively resist them. The most interesting episodes do both simultaneously, giving the audience the familiar structure while filling it with content that surprises. The arrival of Evil Morty in the Citadel, the long game of Rick's revenge quest against Rick Prime, the ongoing question of what lies outside the central finite curve. These are all narrative commitments that reward the audience for having watched from the beginning, for remembering things that were planted seasons before they became relevant. They are the show's way of saying that even with the pressure of a 70-episode order, even with the institutional machinery of a successful franchise operating around the creative work, the people making it are still engaged with the longer story they are telling. Whether they can sustain that engagement across 11 seasons and whatever comes after is a question that only time will answer. What is clear is that the show has so far managed to be something more than the sum of its obligations, which is, given the nature of the industry around it, something like a minor miracle. Supplemental section G. The show's legacy and why any of this matters. Rick and Morty premiered on December 2nd, 2013. As of the time this script was written, it has aired more than 80 episodes across 8 seasons, has received an anime spin-off produced in Japan and animated by Telecom Animation Film, has generated a franchise of comic books, merchandise, and cultural references extensive enough to have become a reference point themselves, and has been renewed for seasons 11 and 12. It has won Emmy Awards. It has been the subject of academic analysis of the kind usually reserved for shows that have been finished long enough to be safely retrospected. The reason any of this matters, the reason this particular show accumulated this particular level of engagement, is not the portal gun or the multiverse or the science fiction concepts. Those are the occasion for the stories. They are not the stories themselves. The stories are about a family that is broken in specific and believable ways, functioning in the particular manner of families that contain people who are very smart and very damaged and not particularly good at expressing the things they feel. The stories are about a man who lost everything he loved and built a life out of what remained. The stories are about a 14-year-old kid who keeps going on adventures that no reasonable version of parental oversight would permit. Not because he wants to, but because the person he has the most complicated love for needs a companion and he cannot say no. The stories are about a woman who built her identity around the approval of someone who was not there during the years when approval mattered most. The stories are about a sad, earnest man who just wants to be useful to people who mostly do not treat him as though he is. These are not science fiction stories. They are human stories wearing science fiction clothing. The clothing is spectacular. The clothing is genuinely impressive and creative and often very funny. But the human stories underneath are what make people come back, are what makes the show linger after the credits roll, are what makes someone lying in the dark at 11 o'clock at night want to listen to someone talk slowly about the hidden layers of it. Rick and Morty says, underneath everything, a show about how people survive the things that damage them. Sometimes they survive badly. Sometimes the survival looks like something you might not recognize as survival from the outside, like a man who turned himself into a pickle to avoid a therapy appointment, like a grandfather who built a voice into his car that sounds like someone he will never see again. Like a kid who keeps erasing the worst parts of what he has been through because the alternative is living with all of it at once. But they keep going. They keep showing up in the garage. They keep choosing each other in their imperfect and occasionally catastrophic way, because the alternative is the specific loneliness of a universe where nothing connects to anything and nothing means anything, and there is no one in the passenger seat to object when you make a decision they think is wrong. The squirrels are running the world. The Cthulhu monster is still out there. The truth tortoise knows something that cannot be known. The dead flies in the garage are arranged just so. And somehow, through all of it, Rick and Morty keeps showing up for another adventure together. That might be enough. That might be, in fact, the whole point. Sleep well.